I am joined today by Chris and Laura. So Chris Adair is the founder of Bottom Dwellers Freediving, and he spent quite some time around our coastline harvesting as well as teaching freediving. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from Chris about the sustainable practices that we can all take on whilst exploring and enjoying our coastline. And we're also joined by Laura Griffith-Cochrane, who works at Ucluelet Aquarium as a curator. And Laura has a wealth of knowledge on all the animals that we find around our coastline and our tidal zones. And Laura, I actually just recently read one of your articles on the heron spawn, which was amazing, in the Tofino Times. So yeah, great to have you guys here today. And I'll just let you guys begin.
Hey, great. So I'm Laura. I'm really stoked to be here. I'm on Ucluelet traditional territory, and we're going to talk about some coastal things. We're going to save questions for the end. There's a lot of stuff for us to cover. Chris and I did a run through today, and we were just like cutting and cutting and cutting because there's so much that we want to talk about. And then I'm also going to apologize ahead of time because I'm actually on mat leave right now. So there may be the occasional kid sound that will happen, but I'll try to mute if things start getting loud. And yeah, this is going to be really fun. Okay.
Awesome, everyone. Thanks for having us here. I'm Chris Adair, founder of Bottom Dwellers Freediving. I'm currently speaking on the Kwungan traditional territories. And yeah, we're here to talk to you guys about sustainable and ethical harvesting foundations. My background is instruction and charter services in freediving and spearfishing and harvesting as well. I have just begun a partnership with some other friends involved locally in the community at Spearfishing Canada. And yeah, we're really excited to kind of be here with you guys tonight. We're thankful that WhaleFest has kind of included us into this speaker series, even though it's not necessarily something that is, I'd say, on the norm with the overall package, but it's something that allows for communication on this topic to come forward on an amazing platform. And we just are really always keen to talk about it and make the open communication and discussion on it for everyone in our local environment and outside of there as well. Yeah.
So we thought we'd start with why we're here. We have some big community goals that we'll talk about a little bit later on in here. But generally what we're dealing with right now is that globally fisheries are in decline. And at the same time, we're dealing with ocean acidification and global warming. So if a lot of those species that are in decline are given the opportunity to recover, there will be challenges that they've never faced before. And that has huge implications towards our food security and then our culture and our recreation, because there's a lot of joy that we have getting in the water. So I'm going to start off with a bit of doom and gloom, but this is the work of one of my favorite biologists. His name is Dr. Daniel Pauly. Here he is here. So he coined the term shifting baselines, and the quote there from his really great TED Talk is, "We change the world, but we forget." So he worked at quantifying the total biomass of fisheries at pre-industrial levels and then current levels. And in these maps that he made, you can see pre-industrial levels of fish. There was this massive amount of biomass, and especially in these upwelling zones, these like hotbeds of bio richness and just like really high density of fish. And then now, this was in 1999, so it's even further depleted. We don't really have any areas that are even at like a medium level of density. And one of the issues there is that, especially as new harvesters, when we jump into the water, we're still in this very beautiful area, and it's an upwelling zone. So there are many different species and there are still fish around. So if we jump in and see fish, we might have this like, oh, this environment is still very healthy, or we're in this pristine ecosystem. But the areas that we're going to go into have been heavily industrially fished for many generations. And so Dr. Pauly's quote, we change the world, but we forget, is that we don't have a lot of knowledge passing from generation to generation, and we are all setting our own baselines. So if I work for my whole life to get this local ecosystem back to what I remember it being like as a child, that's still a level that has already been heavily impacted. And so we need to share information, we need to share stories, so that we can have this goal of pre-industrial levels to work towards. So over to Chris.
Yeah, so within a lot of this, with the base that Laura's talking off of there, education is a big factor within making these sustainable and ethical choices. And it's really important that we act as a communal resource, as one large body to try and pool resources. And within that, but from the grounds up, work at starting with our own foundational knowledge before we're getting out there. Moving on to the next slide, especially because I presume a large amount of people here are going to be interested in the freediving and in water harvesting facet of this talk. It's really important to consider the fact that, yes, throughout this slide series, there will be applied knowledge that you can apply to sustainable and ethical harvesting for hook and line fishing, intertidal harvesting, as well as free dive harvesting. But it's important to remember when you're getting in the water, it's really strongly recommended and encouraged to get out there and get a certification, get the proper instruction and knowledge to have that foundation, that baseline, to learn to do that in water sport before just getting out there and harvesting. So courses can set you up to learn proper risk management and safety, for mitigating risk and making that sport safer, as well as teaching you technique and fundamentals in those aspects. As well, along with the freediving certification, there's also great resources out there on this next slide about freedive harvesting information as well. So the Ucluelet Aquarium has been running sustainable and ethical harvesting programs based for intertidal to hook and line, to also within the freediving snorkeling realm as well. Bottom Dwellers runs its own courses. And then there's also lots of great books out there. And before anyone asks questions, we will have a resources page at the end of this on our favorite books and our favorite resources, as well as Laura's added in a whole bunch of great websites. So those are a great way to just start out if you don't have the funds to quite yet to get into a course, but educate yourself, start with a good foundation. And it's really important to learn what you want to harvest, but also to learn to identify species that you shouldn't be harvesting. It's because in that way, you're not going to make any mistakes. So it's not just learning about the target species, it's learning about the ecosystem as a whole. So within these courses and these books, you can learn about sustainability and ethics, species identification, and then risk management technique and fundamentals, again, of spearfishing and harvesting. So yeah.
Mute. There's a couple of terms I just want to touch on before we get going, and that's sustainability and ethics, because they're often used interchangeably when we talk about fish, but they don't necessarily mean the same thing. So sometimes I'll have a conversation with a harvester and they'll be talking about this incredible fish that they got, and I might have a reaction of like, this is an endangered species, and they're like, it's okay, I used the whole fish. So using the whole of an animal or how you euthanize an animal, that has to do with the ethics of you as a harvester, and the number of species that are there to reproduce is more what we're talking about in terms of sustainability. So those are just two things to keep in mind as we keep going.
So with kind of the principles of sustainability and ethics, and like on that topic too, and moving into rules and regulations, rules and regulations won't always necessarily correlate with the most sustainable path as well. So there's there's sustainability, there's ethics, and then there's also rules and regulations we need to keep in mind when we're working through all of this as harvesters, as line fishermen, as freedivers. And so within that, it's important to try and consider the all-encompassing nature of that. So on these next slides, we're going to be talking about DFO. So DFO is the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. DFO manages Canada's fisheries and safeguards its waters. The Canadian Coast Guard is a special operating agency within DFO, and they're responsible for services and programs contributing to safety, security, and accessibility of Canada's waterways. So DFO is the governing body which manages our rules and regulations for BC Tidal Waters, for which this presentation is focused on. So where do you start with managing DFO's website? There's a lot of people that get really caught up and almost confused with DFO's website. It can be a little archaic and tough to read at times, but it's the resource we have, and it's important to learn how to navigate that when you're going out there to harvest from our tidal waters. So moving on to this next slide, where do you start? You start with getting your license. So applying for a BC Tidal Water license, you can do it as a resident, as a non-resident. There are different fees depending on where you land within that and your age groups. Ultimately, Laura and I both think that this license is ultimately way too affordable, to be honest. And one of the issues that DFO seems to have is underfunding, and this would be a very quick way to help manage that. But we won't go too deep into that because I think that could create some serious debate. So you've acquired your license, you've gone to the website, you've applied for your license, and now you're going to try and get out there. So you need to learn how to research your regulations. You can do that through the BC Fishing app. So the Fishing BC app, this is a great little app. It's pretty intuitive. It's a lot easier to use than the website, but your license is going to be a printed piece of paper that you need to utilize. That printed piece of paper is where you're going to write your annual retention species, and you're not allowed to laminate that piece of paper. It's really important to have it on your person at all time. And as a free diver, it gets a little bit difficult to navigate that. I personally keep mine on my float in a little Pelican case if it's a larger float, or right on the boat, and just have access to it all at all times. So the Fishing BC app is one great way to navigate it. Otherwise, using the paper, the piece of paper. And moving on to the next slide. Within that Fishing BC app, you can actually look up what area you're in. It's really manageable and navigable as you pick the area, you pick the species, and we'll talk about this a bit further in a couple more slides. So you pick the area you're looking to head out into, you pick the species you're looking to get after, and then you can view the regulations. Within that, you're going to need to check out contamination closures, shellfish, paralytic shellfish poisoning closures, and then boundary maps for rockfish conservation areas, marine protected areas, as well as special management areas. You can also report your catch digitally now. I'm still, again, as someone who is always learning from the ins and outs of our DFO regulations online, I'm still in a gray area if you can now utilize that or not with how the wording's been changed. So I'm currently trying to navigate that as well. But to my knowledge, you still need to use the piece of paper. Moving on to the next slide there. So when we're navigating these regulations, your rules and regulations are going to fall into defined as the area and sub areas where you're going to start. So you know where you're going and you know what you're looking to try and harvest and catch. So you're going to look for the area and then the sub area within that. You know what species you're going after, and you're going to need to determine what equipment you're going to utilize to harvest that species. So you want to know before you go. You want to have all of these little pieces figured out. So area, sub area, limits for the species you're going after, size restrictions, the RCAs that are going to be in those zones you're going to and areas you're going to, and then the restrictions within that. There will be closure changes, area to area and zone to zone, especially with shellfish. Shellfish can be really tricky to navigate, but that's something that the restriction side of things is going to be really important. So for each species, there will also be restrictions that you need to observe, and you'll need to research that as you go through those species. So the species are broken into tabs such as popular species, salmon, other fin fish, bivalve, shellfish, crab, other invertebrates, and then protected areas. So when you click into an area, you will end up with a bunch of tabs that on the next slide we'll be able to show that, as well as the gear specifications. So this is how you kind of navigate in a very rough way through DFO's website. So you would actually click to the DFO, you would navigate to the DFO website however you got there, and then you would hit the fisheries tab. You would click on recreational fishing that you see in the top left tab there as it's pulled down and underlined in that second column over. And when you click that, it'll take you to a where are you fishing tab. From there, since we're part of the Pacific Rim Whale Festival, we would say select Area 24, Tofino Flores, Mears Island area. And you would select that area. There's Area 24, which is the inshore area, and then Area 124, which is the outer shore area. Once you click on an area, you'll end up with a page that'll give you what's in the bottom right there. You see a bunch of tabs. You see, again, that area map. If you don't mind going back once there, it's okay, Laura. Yeah, area map, popular species, salmon, other finfish, and from there you can select those tabs to hone in on what you're going after to get the gear specifications, the limits, the size restrictions, and then your links to extra restrictions that'll be at the bottom of those pages. So yeah, heading on to the next slide now. So what you're seeing in the left photo here is Area 20, and disclaimer, these are not current regulations, so do not go by these. These are a screenshot from a while back. So navigating to Area 24, you see there's area or sub area 24.1, 24.2, 24.3, and through. This is what it would look like for the bivalve shellfish contamination page. This ultimately for bivalves governs what your openings and closures are going to be for bivalves. You will still see species openings for the certain species, but the PSP closure, the paralytic shellfish poisoning closure, is what will truly open or close the area in concordance with DFO law. It's really important to observe these. Paralytic shellfish poisoning is not something that would be very nice to get. It's a toxin that attacks the respiratory system and paralyzes it. So making sure your regulations are checked, making sure you are checking them that day or as soon as you, or as closely as you can to diving, because they can change overnight or throughout a day. There's a really neat resource you can use from DFO that a lot of people aren't familiar with, and you can actually register and sign up to an email list for the specific species that you're hoping to harvest. So you can select finfish, you can select salmonoid species, and within those you can get email notifications to real-time restriction changes. And those real-time restriction changes are great for just quick reference when they come out. If you're heading somewhere and then one comes out, say while you're in transit, you can check that and know that that would have been a change. So what you see again in the left is you see a bunch of closed areas for the bivalves. The DFO doesn't have a ton of funding to test all these areas. So there's a lot of closures, but there are areas that are open. And usually when you see an area that is open, it's usually due to an aquaculture farm being in the area. So a oyster farm or a shellfish farm or something that is required to do the testing in these areas. And then it's a third party that is doing the testing that then gives the information to the BC CDC, which then approves the area for opening. These tests are done regularly. I believe once you get your first two done, it's done on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and you need to continue to get the specimen to the BC CDC for this. It takes a lot of labor and time, and they use baseline species for a lot of this. It's, again, just something that really should be observed when going through the regulations. In the top right, you'll see another screenshot there. So there's 3 screenshots on this page. You see that is now the breakdown of finfish. Finfish, there's a variety of them on this top right screenshot. You can see there's everything from greenling, halibut, lingcod, and then a variety of other species. This is a screenshot from an area 24 or 124 and 124's area map. So really focusing on 24 because 124 would be pretty deep offshore. And then, so you have your first column, which is your species, your second column there, that is the area, your third column where you only see the one size restriction. So that is the 65 centimeters that's there. And that's your minimum size restriction for lingcod. So lingcod have a minimum size restriction, and then halibut also have size restrictions, but it's written in their restrictions, which isn't just, it'll vary and change depending on the season with their opening. But primarily the lingcod, as the example here, you're allowed to keep anything that's over 65 centimeters as the minimum requirement. And then you're allowed to utilize hook, line, and spear to get them to harvest them. Sorry, it looks like we've had a little bit of technical difficulty there on the slide, so I'll see if I can pull it up here. 1 second. I think we lost Laura. Oh, we got her back.
I'm so sorry, guys. Rookiest of moves.
All good.
Yeah.
No worries at all. When you can, if you want to reopen it to that slide,
Okay.
no rush.
I'm gonna bring my screen back up.
Yeah, I'll just keep talking about regulations.
Yeah.
So that last column we were talking about was the size restriction column. After the size restriction, you have your equipment requirements, which you can have hook and line, spear, by spear, or hand picking. There's a variety of different equipment you're allowed to use. There's more than that as well, but for the species in question here, we're after either hook and line and or spear. And then, which will make a little bit more sense when the slides back up. But I think you'll need to share your screen again, Laura.
Yeah, I'm just working on it 1 second.
Is that there is a daily possession and an annual limit to some of these species. So for some species, you're allowed a daily limit, which is also attached to a possession limit. So that column that is, if you want to pop back one slide. Yeah, that column that is in the second to the right there, you'll see there's 3 numbers and there's a slash between each one. The first number, and it'll say at the top of that page, it'll say D, P, and A. So D/P/A/. The D is the daily column, the P is the possession column, and the A is the annual column. So the daily limit is what you're allowed to retain that day. The possession limit it can change fish to fish, but the possession limit is usually a 2-day limit. And it is in this zone, if you had a daily of 2 lingcod, say, you would have a possession of 4. So on a multi-day trip, you are only allowed to carry, even if it's a 4 or 5-day trip, up to 4 lingcod on you at one time. You're not allowed to go over that. You would need to be making it home, putting the fish in store before going back out to harvest again. The last column you see there, which you can see in the halibut row, is the 6 for the halibut. Just for the halibut. Yeah. So 1 possession, sorry, 1 daily, 2 possession, and then 6 for the annual. So the annual limit is what you're allowed in this area to retain for halibut. Lingcod, they have an annual limit on inside waters. So on the outer waters of Tofino area, Bamfield area, all the way up to Port Hardy, there is no annual limit, almost to Port Hardy. And then on the inside waters of Vancouver Island, there's an annual limit attached to lingcod where you're allowed 1 per day, 2 possession, and then 10 annual for those different areas. So again, becoming familiar with where you're going, what you're harvesting is really important. And then also knowing your protected areas. So knowing your rockfish conservation areas, knowing your marine protected areas, your glass sponge reefs, And this, especially this slide here, is one to note for the Pacific Rim area. So Pacific Rim National Park Reserve and its Pacific fishery management areas. So it is attached to marine waterways that have their own special rules and regulations, and you will find those in the Area 24 regulations. But Pacific Rim waters are actually closed to harvest by diving, and it's important to know where those geographical locations start and end. This is a very generic map, a screenshot of it, but there will be an actual more physical detailed area map with geographical, I guess, Latin longs. And it essentially goes from, in the Tofino area, from South Cox Bay to Waya Point. And then there is more protected Pacific Rim waters in the Broken Island group. And then from the headland near Bamfield, south all the way to the mouth of the Port San Juan, those waters are protected from harvest by diving and fishing. So it's, again, really important to understand your regulations, and it doesn't make it super easy when certain protected areas, such as ecological reserves, you may need to find those in BC Parks websites rather than in on DFO's website. So it's, again, just doing research, understanding where you're going, knowing parks and reserves where you're going, and what the rules and regulations within all that is. It's a bit of a task at first, but once you get the hang of it, it does get easier and easier, and you find the rhythm of figuring out how to navigate DFO's website. So moving on to the next slide here. Yeah, we've given you a little foundation of how to read the regulations on the basics. We've talked about what the difference between sustainability and ethics is, and now we're going to start talking about species selection. So I'm going to hand it back over to the biologists to talk about species.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for being patient with me. So because a lot of things in the ocean can be really doom and gloom, we thought we'd start with a species that is really sustainable. Urchin populations are actually at an all-time high right now. The urchin that's in this photograph is a red urchin. These guys, if you find them with a test of 30 centimeters across, so the test is that circular part to the body that doesn't include the spines, they can be 200 years old. So super long-lived species, a history of predators being extracted from BC, California, and Alaskan coasts. Red urchins, as well as their relatives, purple urchins and green urchins and white urchins, their populations are up. There's actually a recent report on kelp forests that was just released that was showing how California coasts, you can see the kelp forest decimation from space, which is really sad. So if you choose to harvest an urchin, you are getting a local delicious food. Urchins are rich in iron. They have some enzymes that are reported to help with sleep, and they've been used by Nachalneth nations to treat arthritis. So there's a lot of really good things that are there. And then you're also doing great things for the ecosystem. We're going to breeze through a few different species as we continue talking here. And there's so many that we would like to talk about, but because we're just doing this for an hour, we're just going to roll into a lot of ones. But there's a lot of other invertebrates that I'd highly recommend looking into.
Definitely. Yeah, I would too. And I wish we could spend more time talking about it all. But yeah, so with these urchins, yeah, lots of great benefits to actually harvesting them. One, for our ecosystem, but two, it sounds like for our health. But they're actually really easy to harvest too, and they're a great way to start out. Ultimately, on a really low tide, you could harvest them without even diving. You could harvest them wading. If you're out there snorkeling, free diving, and harvesting them, you're going to want a few key pieces of equipment. You're just going to want a float. You're going to want a catch bag. You want to be able to clip those two things together. The float can act as the support and carry the weight of the catch bag, because a lot of urchins can get heavy really fast. The other thing is it marks you safely to boats nearby. And then Yeah, you're going to also want either a rake or a flat bar or something. You can harvest urchins by hand, and that's fine. You're a lot more effective at it if you have a little something to pry them off with. Some people can use a long knife blade and get it under there too, but they have little feet under their bodies like starfish do. And if you bump them, they'll actually suction down onto the rock. Which if you don't get them in time, you're going to have a lot of trouble actually lifting them off the rock while they're suctioned down. So you could grab them so hard you could actually pierce holes through your glove at that point. Ultimately, you can harvest them like in this photo here and handle them no problem, and you won't have issues. They're spiky, but they're not razor sharp. That being said, you don't want to break one of their spikes off inside you, because it's basically like broken shards of bacteria infested glass, and it does not feel good having to wait for it to get pushed out by your body. Yeah, so moving on.
I just saw a couple questions pop up, so I will answer them, but we're just going to keep going for the time being, and then we'll get to questions at the end. So there's been,
this is an example of what it would look like. On the right, that's gooseneck barnacles. Those are also delicious, very easily accessible, intertidal, shore surf in intertidal species. But on the left there, those are a couple open urchins. You're eating the gonads, the roe within those urchin there, and it's a very rich acquired taste for some people, but it's very good. I really enjoy it. I've learned to love it, and you can feel really good about enjoying a species that you're also helping protect the kelp forests while you're eating them at the same time. So it's kind of like a win-win. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so then we're going to talk about a couple of fish species. The first being lingcod. So lingcod are loyal to different nesting sites. Males return to the same sites each year. They come up into shallower, fast-moving water, and females will lay eggs that the males then guard. They really like these shallow waters because they're very oxygen rich, and with fast moving currents, you are able to make sure that no algae or bacteria will start growing on the eggs. A couple things about lingcod. They're not actually a cod. I'm particular about names because I think it helps to inform us about the life histories of these species. So there's 12 or 13 different species of fish in BC that often get referred to as cod that are not cod. So a true cod has 3 dorsal fins, and it has a little barbel thing coming off of its chin. And another thing that I'll talk about as well with rockfish is that lingcod get better at reproducing as they get older. I think it's really interesting if you think about menopause, like the fact that humans stop reproducing, that the reproductive potential slows down as they get older. There are very few species on the planet that go through menopause. There's elephants, humans, killer whales. There are beliefs that some other whale populations may go through menopause, but even some of our closer monkey relatives don't go through menopause. So as lingcod get older, they are more effective at reproducing.
Another really neat thing about the lingcod too, from a harvesting standpoint, is by the time they are minimum, a species that has reached their minimum required size, they're already more than 50% reproductive, which means they're possibly have already had a chance to reproduce, which is great because a lot of the rockfish type species, they take several years to hit their reproductive maturities. So anyways, I just thought that's another cool fact, because you can kind of feel good about them being quite a sustainable choice, and also probably one of the better tasting fish that we have in our oceans, as far as I'm concerned anyways. Yeah.
Sorry, I've got a fast trigger finger with these slides. Going into some rockfish, rockfish species are notoriously long-lived, and they can be very hard to age, sometimes very hard for us to ID between different species, and they don't help with being able to change color. So some species will look a certain way when they're younger and really change color as they get older. China rockfish are a species I really like to talk about because it highlights the need to really pay attention to your location when you go harvesting. China rockfish can live about 80 years. And they're also very site loyal, similar to lingcod, but even more so. So China rockfish have been found to sometimes have a territory of only 2 meters in size. So imagine spending 80 years of your life under 6 feet. They're incredibly beautiful to see, but many of their predators would be coming at them from the top. And so they'll really wedge themselves in rocks, which can mean it's easy for us to get them.
Yep. Yeah, and I've got a pretty, well, a story that kind of hit home with me on China rockfish, like knowing these stats and specifics about them as a fish, that they're long lived. They actually don't get very big. Like I think 4 pounds is the largest recorded size ever. And for a fish that's living up to 80 years of age, that's not very large. So I came across this one China when I was hunting the reef one day, and it was I've actually never taken a China rockfish on the spear, just because I think they're very beautiful. The spotting that you see on their pectoral fin there, like you can see it's got that little iridescent blue to it. The rest of the spots actually have it too, and if you catch them in the shadows with flickering light on them, those spots light up. They're really, really stunning. But I came across this one that was bigger than any other I had seen, and I was like, oh, I think I might, this is big enough for the dinner table, I might take it. But then I was calm and composed enough that I had that second thought that was like, oh, wait a second, that means that this is going to be the oldest China rockfish that I've ever seen. It's going to be a big breeder, and I'm just going to leave that and let it stay to reproduce. And like Laura said, it had a hole, it had a home, and it was popping in and out of there. And it was kind of cool to play with it. And it's one of those things that becoming a sustainable and ethical harvester, it's not something that's just handed to you when you have a spear gun. It's something that you need to make those right choices within it, and you're always living and learning from those experiences. And that was one that really, I don't know, I felt good coming out of that at the end, even though I didn't bring the big fish home for dinner. It was nice to leave it behind. So yeah, anyways, there's just a story I had to share on China rockfish. They're really stunningly beautiful, as you can see though, with that contrast between that yellow lateral line and the dark base. Just a really magnificent little fish.
Yeah. So the next one that I really like to talk about, this is an important one because it's a non-retention species. So you are not allowed to collect this one. And it's another one that is often misnamed. So yellow eye rockfish are often called red snapper. There's actually no snapper species at all in the North Pacific, in BC's North Pacific, but that's what most people know it as. And even canary rockfish and vermilion rockfish are often called red snapper. You can even legally sell it as red snapper, and pretty much any Pacific rockfish species can be called Pacific snapper when it goes onto the market. But these guys were very heavily fished because they can get big. They have a 140-year lifespan and a 20-year length to maturity. So only about half of female rockfish have reached sexual maturity by age 20. Some of them take even longer. So it just gives you an idea for how long and how sensitive that species can be. And like lingcod, they're super producers. So studies on vermilion rockfish, which are very similar to these guys, found that a 20-year-old would release about 18,000 larvae, but an 80-year-old would release well over 1 million. And then if you were to compare the larvae of those two species, the larva of the 80-year-old is much bigger, so it's got a much higher success, likelihood of success. So those big old fish are really important for us to have around if we're going to be able to keep harvesting them. This guy in particular is one that I really fell in love with. This is a picture from in the aquarium, and she would follow me around. There was a male that would change color. He would revert back to his juvenile colors and try to flirt with her. And she was probably too young. She wasn't really interested. And she would just like cruise around and watch what we were doing. And yeah, I really fell in love with her. So there's one. Yeah. So yeah, this is one that has been harvested, but just a reminder that currently rules have changed. So you are not allowed to harvest them, and same with Boccaccio. Black rockfish are, if you're going to harvest a rockfish, the more sustainable option. They live about 50 years. There's only 6 years to maturity. And they tend to school together in really tight groups.
Yeah, they're a great choice. The schooling aspect of them is really awesome, especially for people starting out. They'll be shallow in the water column. They'll even be jumping at the surface the right times of year. So you can actually see these ones from the surface. You don't have to dive deep to find these guys. And honestly, they taste great. I think there's a really odd kind of mentality with a lot of our fishing, just with the fishing communities in general, where like things that are rarer are more sought after. And this is one of the most common, I'd say, rockfish or fish to see, even as far as their numbers and their populations. And they are actually really good eating when prepared right, or even prepared kind of half right. But they're a great fish. They're a great choice. And like, this is actually the only rockfish that I'll take on inside waters. So for myself, from Souk area to sort of Port McNeil, Port Hardy area, just because the populations, as you spend more time on the reef, one of the decisions you get to make is observing the overall health of that reef. So that's one beautiful thing about the connection that freedivers have to being in the water, where they are hunting and harvesting their catch from, is we actually get to see the health of the reef in general. And that allows us to make judgment calls on, okay, this species, there's a lot of them on this reef, we can feel good about, possibly removing this one and that one. Whereas if you're not getting down there to see, it's hard to make that call. So again, it just leads to building more knowledge and allowing you to make those decisions in that sustainable and ethical mindset. Yeah, beautiful fish. You can see they school in large numbers, and yeah, they're pretty docile too once you're part of the school.
Mm-hmm. So now we're going to talk about a few fish because they're really interesting from like a beauty, but also from a gear perspective. So red Irish lords are one of the larger sculpins. They're just really, really stunning. Sculpins have a common name that people use. It's bullhead, and I find that's really interchangeable with a lot of different species. I have a cheat for how to identify different sculpins. Like once you start looking at a lot of photographs, I look for the barbels, or their little skin pieces that hang off of their face. It sounds really gross. But red Irish lords tend to have almost like a little beard of pieces that stick out, and it helps them gather information about their world. The cabezons, which are a species that they're often confused with. That's the guy in the middle. They have eyebrows, those are called cirri, and they have one piece that comes straight off of their nose. No other fish have that. That's like a really indicative thing of a cabezon. And then buffalo sculpins, the things that really stick out off of them are these spines that come off of their gill covers. And those are pretty nasty. They're barbed. So if you get them stuck in your hand, it can be really awful to get rid of or to release yourself from. But there are strict rules about the gear types that you're allowed to use for these sculpins. We see your Instagram posts. I know that many of you spearfish for them, but you're not supposed to. And that's something that I think is really important to address, because if we create a culture of saying that regulations don't really matter because we don't think that they are really important, then that can get us into a lot of trouble. And it also it makes us not very reputable and very hard to deal with. It would be hard for us to argue that maybe there needs to be a regulation change to support our fishing type if we're just running around flaunting regulations. So I think it's really important that we keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I can just add to that too, Laura. Like,
Mhm.
so what Laura's talking about is that in gear and equipment for specific species is it's listed as hook and line only, and spear is technically not part of that equipment. They are a species that, yeah, you're allowed 8 of them per day through hook and line, no annual limit. And I've personally actually written motions to have that changed. I had it passed at local level, I had it passed at regional level, and then it kind of just disappeared. And now it's something that needs to start over again. But it's something that as a community, with what Laura's talking about, is we need to communicate with the proper authorities and go through the steps of changing that professionally, to not give ourselves a certain rep or name. And I know some people have talked to DFO agents that have said both sides of the coin on that for them, but it's just something to, and I'll talk about this a bit in a later slide about representing yourself. But otherwise, I think it's just a really good point that Laura's making. Well, I love these sculpins. They're extremely beautiful fish. The highlighted orange on the fins of the buffalo sculpin is so cool. Cabezon is a beautiful fish in itself, really stubborn too. They love to stand their ground around you. I swear I got in a knife fight with one once. And then the red Irish lord, those are very sought after by the scuba community. They're very photogenic. They come in so many different colors. And those are some choices you should be making as a sustainable ethical harvester too, is working with the other aquatic enthusiasts. A red Irish lord, they don't get well, they can get big, but a lot of the ones I've seen personally have been, so yay big, but I guess they can get to a larger size. But you got to consider also the size of the fish you're removing from the reef, and also the regulations. So anyways, that's just my little add to that one.
Yeah, really beautiful fish. Yeah, so Chris is going to talk a little bit more about catching fish.
Yeah, so whether you're line fishing or spearfishing, hunting, catching fish, it's important, especially with spearfishing, more so with the shot placement thing, is treat spearfishing like you're treating hunting. You own your shot before you take it. You make sure you are having as little impact to fish as possible. So you're trying not to miss any fish, not to maim, not to wound. So you want to own the shot. You want to have a good shot placement, somewhere where it's going to hold, avoid the belly meat. A gill plate is a great spot. Head on lingcod is really good too, if you can get the flopper to set well in it or through it. Dispatching of your fish, you want to dispatch of it as quickly as possible. This photo on the left might seem a little graphic to some, but it's actually probably the most humane, quickest way we can dispatch of that fish once we've shot it. So you're spiking or braining the fish and you're bleeding it to preserve the meat quality. And then storing of your catch, you want to make sure that you have a good plan for a cooler with ice for transport, and be able to be well set up for preserving and respecting your catch. And that goes to all of your catch. For urchin, keep them on ice, keep them cool as well. For crabs, for prawns, when you're getting them, don't just throw them in a bucket on deck and don't recycle that salt water, because they can actually suffocate themselves in that water if you leave it still for too long. Okay, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about some more invertebrate species because they're very popular. There's a few different species that we really love to eat. And some of them you might be very common or very comfortable with already, like Dungeness crabs and red rock crabs. But there's also the Puget Sound king crab that's growing in popularity. Yes. Chris is just going to tell you a little bit about telling them apart.
Yeah, so all of these crabs, it's a restriction to keep female crabs. So you need to be able to identify between male and female. You also need to understand that your equipment restrictions are to hand picking or by trap. For identifying between male and female, the common ground is that the female abdomen is more rounded. So you can see that the female here has a igloo type shape and the male has a lighthouse. I've also heard of a U for the female and a V for the male. And I heard a new one today is what was it? It was a hive for the female, but then the lighthouse again for the male. Yeah. So for Dungeness and rock crab, that would be a very good depiction of what a female and male would look like. For a Puget Sound king crab, however, it gets a little bit more difficult to tell the difference at first. It's not as defined when you first see it, but the more you see it, the more defined it becomes. The main distinguishing factor for myself between the female, which is on the left, the male, which is on the right, is again, that male has a more angular pointed shape on the right, as you can see. The female is much more rounded, but the female's abdomen will actually also hide the last knuckles of the legs. So you can see on the male that the full knuckle is showing to the abdomen. If you look closely, so I'm talking the V that you see in there. Maybe you want to draw it out with the cursor, Laura. Just, yeah, draw. So that's the V there. And you can see how there's a couple knuckles to the legs that are still showing on, especially on those rear two legs on both sides. Whereas on the female, that knuckle is basically hidden on the last leg, and then only half of it is showing on the second leg. So this is a very identifying factor between male and female. Also, their carapaces are a little more round. When you get a really good eye for identifying female and male for crabs, you actually can almost start picking out and having a good guess from above. I'm not saying you can do it every time, but you can start getting a pretty good, oh yeah, that's going to be a female. But you always are wrong every once in a while too. So that's the general principle for identifying between male and female crabs, yeah, or Puget Sound kigs and Dungeness and rock. Yeah.
So they're really important to talk about because
sure.
they highlight something that's true for a lot of species out here, but especially for them, we really don't know very much about them. There's a lot of species in the Pacific Northwest that just haven't really been very sexy or haven't been seen as commercially valuable. So it's very hard to get funding to study them. And that's true for these guys. We don't know anything about them at all. There has never been a study on them. So what that means is if you went to Washington State, it's illegal to touch them. But up here, you are allowed to collect them. But that just highlights that we should be very, very careful about them. Everything that we think we know is because of their closest relatives, the brown box crabs. So brown box crabs look like this, and sometimes people refer to Puget Sound king crabs as box crabs because they look very similar. Studies on these ones have shown that they brood their eggs for 18 months. So that's a huge amount of time. So they may live about 40 or 50 years, but we don't know exact lifespans yet. This is me holding a box crab. You can see there are these beautiful perfect circles that are built into their claws and shell, and that's so that they can breathe when they're buried in the sand. But with Puget Sound king crabs, we are just making assumptions that we know that they're similar to these. But if you think about us as predators, wetsuit technology is very recent, and even like people wanting to jump in the water, even with wetsuit technology, is pretty recent. Like our sport is growing, and especially with Instagram and with social media, which Chris is going to talk about in a little bit, posting this like really cool looking transformer like orange and purple and yellow crab is really beautiful. But we could have a disproportionate effect on the species now that we're entering this aquatic ecosystem and able to access something we were never able to do before.
Yeah, just on that note too, with what you're talking about there, Laura, I do think that there is a really good example to use. Like, regulations aren't totally always supportive of what could be sustainable. And honestly, with Laura saying, we don't have enough information, but there is no annual retention on this crab species. So the way like Washington has a complete closure on Puget Sound king crabs, whereas up here it's just open and you're allowed one per day all year round. Maybe a middle ground would be to have that annual retention of a certain amount of species, which in my mind would be very low. So you could still enjoy it for harvest, but it's still, yeah, it's something to be discussed. And again, something that should be moved forward as a community. And yeah, I'll talk about a bit more about community discussion and openness on that too. But yeah, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, and so that brings me into the next thing where I really like to make a comparison of fishing and hunting, because I think it's really interesting about how new harvesters enter into the fishing or hunting worlds. So if you wanted to get into hunting in British Columbia, you would have to pass the CORE, that's the Conservation Outdoor Recreation Education Program. And it involves both a practical and a written test. You have to prove you know how to use your equipment. So you have to, like you would have already had to prove you know how to use guns safely for your gun course, but you have to do that again as part of your CORE. You also then have to do a written test to show that you know the basics of conservation ethics, laws, first aid, safety, species ID, and Indigenous peoples. So you have to prove that you know what it is you're hunting for. And there is this really big sense of community in the hunting world, and it is sort of there with fishing, but in a very different way. The hunting community has these very effective conservation groups. Ducks Unlimited is the #1 protector of wetlands in all of North America, and it has global protection campaigns that have been going on. It's a hunting club that protects the ability to hunt ducks, and it has protected wetlands, which are important to all kinds of species. But we don't really have the equivalent in the fishing world. And then we also don't really hold the fishing industry accountable for correct terminology. And I like to make this comparison of a couple things. So if you order cod on the menu, there's no guarantee that you know that what you think is in your mind of what fish you're getting is what you're going to get. There's a lot of legal terminology that's pretty cryptic. And then there's also a lot of malicious fraud that goes on. I imagine going to a restaurant and ordering like a steak dinner and then finding out later that it was moose, and then going back the next day and they're like, oh, well, we had rabbit tonight, so that's what we served you. And that being a totally legal thing to do. And that just creates all kinds of issues and problems. And so part of the questions that we have, and the reason we're doing this education, is that we're kind of trying to create a fishing core, a way that we can gather together, we can have community, and we can have good questions to ask ourselves.
Definitely, that's our end goal with what we're trying to accomplish through our programs. And #1 thing to take from that is don't order the snapper, not in BC.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So you've got some species identification knowledge. Obviously, there's a lot more to learn on that stuff. We wanted to give you some key species that are very sought after so that you could utilize some of the same common themes that you're seeing and apply that to other species as you start learning them. So when you go out, this is kind of like the harvesting toolkit, like what you need to consider before and as you're going out there. So things that we're going to want to cover are, where am I going? So where am I going harvesting? Is it a pretty popular area to go? What time of day am I going? What are daylight hours? What is the current doing? What is the tide doing? What is wind and swell doing? So 1, you can be safe out there, but 2, you know the zone and area you're going to so that you can formulate your grocery list for that you're going out to catch. One thing that I love about the freedive harvesting and freediving community that we're all a part of is people seem to go out with the mentality of harvesting for dinner, for meals, and for the next little bit, more so than harvesting to fill licenses and fill the freezer. You got to also consider what all the components that you want to harvest as far as that full meal for how many people when you go out, if you're doing it for a specific meal. But yeah, otherwise you got to consider how to handle your catch, how you're going to transport it. If you're line fishing, you got to consider, what am I going to do with my bycatch? So it's a requirement by DFO regulations to have descenders on your boats now. A descender is a device that will actually allow you to descend a rockfish back to depth. Rockfish are subject to barotrauma on ascent. When you reel them up, their swim bladder will inflate. If you want to learn about Boyle's Law and why that happens, you can sign up and take a freediving course. I can tell you all about that. But it's really important to be able to descend these rockfish, because otherwise their bladder inflates and they can't get back down, and then they're just sitting ducks. Yeah, so having good practice if you're line fishing with descenders for rockfish. Yeah, how will I make sure I practice good habits? So thinking about those choices you need to make for sustainable and ethical choices. So size of the species, do I want to take that big breeder off of this reef, or do I want to leave it to breed another day? What are the nesting periods of these fish? What is the age that this fish lives to, and the size, its max size that it lives to, and making choices within that stuff to help you I feel better about your catch overall. Social media use becomes a bit of it can be such a positive thing, but it can also be such a negative thing. So with social media use, you need to just be weary of your general use, be respectful that there is anyone could be observing that. A photo like this can have negative effects. It's something that I'm trying to be more careful with as I grow as a sustainable ethical harvester. Is a photo like this will instill that want and desire for someone else to go back out and best that PB, better your fish or better their own. And some people just don't want to see dead fish. Some people don't want to see gore. So consider your use of social media in respects to a lot of that. Respect each other, have the conversations. You don't have to get on the defense. You don't have to go on the offense in social media. Just openly ask someone a question and be polite. It's amazing the conversations that can come about it all. Another thing that comes up with social media is, on this next slide, is the use of locations. Laura made a great point when some discussion we were having earlier that we tend to hide our locations and our spots that we go as fishermen, as spearfishers, as harvesters. And yeah, we do that because we want to preserve and protect those areas. It can also have a negative effect where we don't know how many people are going there and harvesting from those areas because everyone's keeping it hidden, but maybe we're all just sharing the same spot anyways. Having said that though, a way to manage that would be having DFO, having a better reporting system for our harvest and our catch to try and preserve and make sure that our fish populations aren't being hit super hard. The other thing we need to consider is posting backgrounds and driving too many people to a site. If you post someone holding up a fish, or if someone posts holding up a fish and then there's a backdrop, people are going to try and figure out where that was, and you can really blow up a spot, and then you can negatively put too much pressure on a spot. And it's really important to respect the park regulations, the ecological sites. And yeah, I think I just saw a question come up about First Nations territories, and yeah, respect the land on which you're cutting across to go to where you're getting to. So yeah, it is important to ask permission if you're going across lands, and yeah, there's a lot that comes with it, but social media can also be a really positive thing in building community too. So yeah, moving on to the next slide here. There's a great way to forge community, and it's having open conversations. Social media can be used, events, but a lot of it comes from general open understanding and respect for each other and respect for a communal goal. And yeah, Laura's gonna continue on this with the next.
So here's some resources. Like what Chris was talking about with having conversations, sometimes on social media, when people will question each other, there can be almost like a defensive thing. Well, I know what I'm talking about. The problem with species in the Pacific is that we don't actually usually know what we're talking about. And so it's so important for us to have the ability to share. So if one year the lingcod populations are doing really well, and the next year they're not doing super well, it's important to share those observations and make sure that we're all doing our best. I've got a list of some favorite books. Some of them are field guides, and some of them are stories, because going back to that thing about Daniel Pauly, we change the world, but we forget. I think storytelling is so important, especially when it's multi-generational storytelling, so that we can learn about what populations were like long ago, and that will inform our goals about how we should get back to a healthier ecosystem. And then some of them are just really fun. So the Sea Forager's Guide to the North California Coast. I love this guy, Kirk Lombard, is nuts. He forages for everything. He's got great stories. I think he does tours in San Francisco, so look him up if the border opens and we get to go down and have fun, hopefully soon. Yeah, so there's lots of really good ones there. Websites. Going on to Nikki's question on the chat, I put nativeland.ca. This is a really good website where you can see what First Nations territory you're on, and then that can be really helpful. It really depends on, practices really depend on the nation. That is something that can be so different depending on where you're going. So it's really important to not assume that because you know what happens in one place, it will be okay, or you'll have the same protocols in the next place. So there can be all kinds of different tools, like calling the nation office or reaching out to the community. There's also fisheries guardians within some territories, and that can be really helpful too. I have, going on to another website, Modern Huntsman is a journal that I really love. It has beautiful photography and really wonderful stories. It talks a lot about that, like, culture and community of harvesting. Most of it is about hunting, but there's some really wonderful aquatic stories on there too. A couple of nerd ones. I really like Mola Marine. That's Dr. Jensen's lab's website, and it's got some really good free resources. There's downloadable free flatfish guides, links to his books. There's all kinds of good stuff there. And then the Oregon Department of Fish and Game has quizzes, which are really good. So if you want to test your rockfish ID skills, there's a good quiz on there. There's one called Yellow Eye or Not. And then the bottom fish, which is rockfish generally. And then community. I like, this is a plug for both mine and Chris's organizations. The Ucluelet Aquarium is where I work, or I'm on mat leave, but I will be back in August. And come in and talk to us. We're nerds. We love to talk about fish. We love to learn more information from people that are on the emerging sides of things, or are observing, and then we love to share the information that we already have. And then Facebook groups are a really good resource too. And I know there's pros and cons to Facebook, but there are some Facebook groups out there. There's some spearfishing and harvesting ones. There's some other naturalist groups, and they can be wonderful for fish ID.
Yeah, for sure. Like, and as much as I kind of maybe focused on some of the negatives and don'ts of social media, it can be such a powerful tool, and there's some great community, and it's really a neat way for a lot of people to engage, and for people to get involved. Like, there's lots of great projects that are be coming up down the road with Bottom Dwellers and Spearfishing Canada. Bottom Dwellers is a free dive instruction and charter service company that I own and operate. And then, so if you're looking to get out there in the water, again, it's important to get trained up before jumping out there. Wherever you're from, there's great agencies. Like if you're in Vancouver area, reach out to Oceanoid. Roberta's great at Oceanoid. And it's just important to get certified if you're going to be getting out there and learn about the risk management that comes with freediving. Spearfishing Canada is our new partnership with, well, I'm a partner in it with a couple longtime friends that I've freedive and spearfish with. And it's an e-commerce, but also local community platform where we're looking to develop and build just resources for the local community and kind of be a center point for knowledge share as well within our freediving and harvesting community. So yeah, we want to thank you guys hugely for having us as part of this. It was a really neat experience. Laura and I haven't got to do anything in a while with how the last year's gone, and we've had lots of plans too. So Bottom Dwellers, Ucluelet Aquarium, and Spearfishing Canada, all thank you guys big time. And we just want to say thanks to as well Jeremy Koreski for all the great photos he's done for us over the years. Iko Jones for a lot of those beautiful identification photos there, and to Finora Marina and Nemo Bay Resort again for all the times and fun that we've had to be able to kind of bring a lot of this together. So yeah, and I think we're good to open for a Q&A panel now if we have time.
There's no limit here. Thank you, Chris and Laura. That was super helpful. We're going to open this up to the audience shortly. But for me personally, just you guys touching on reminding us about sustainability versus ethics and how to use social media. That's something that, you know, doesn't really occur to me from day to day, and I will take a lot from that. I'm at the point right now where I'm exploring the tidal zone through freediving, but I'm not harvesting or spearfishing. But this has really like broken down for me how much time I need to put in to do this responsibly. And the beauty of this is we can all download this talk and use it as a step-by-step guide to help us get set up. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So there are a couple of questions as we were going along. So the first one that I saw, because I'm so sorry, I cut out there for a second, from Brad, are there any issues or concerns with sea urchins holding toxins from the water? There can be. Urchins aren't filter feeders. So like like scallops and clams and geoducks, they're not going to absorb toxins in the same way that some other organisms will. But if there's poor water quality, that will become a part of their body. So I wouldn't recommend harvesting them from anywhere where there's like a sewage outflow or any kind of contamination. Not that you probably would anyway, but while they're not affected by PSP or some of those other shellfish poisoning issues, there can still be water quality issues. And then from Kiora, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, from boats bringing in large numbers of urchins. There are urchin diving is a big industry out here. And so teams of divers will go down and they'll have usually a pry bar and they just collect urchins in large numbers and then crate them up into big groups. There's a couple of guys that I know that live locally and work full-time as urchin divers. And if you Google image urchin barrens or urchin overpopulation, you'll see these images of like this huge area and it's just a desert, just like carpet, like inch to inch covered in urchins. And urchins have this really fascinating ability to go into a dormant state. And so if they're not getting enough to eat, they will reduce their whole metabolism, stop producing their reproductive organs, and just kind of hang out waiting for more food. I kind of imagine like, oh, sorry.
Hollow urchin zombies.
Yeah, they're crazy. And which is awful because one, there are too many, but two, their commercial value is gone. So people don't want to harvest them as much because there's no gonads in their body to eat. So yeah, but it's a pretty crazy thing to look at. I really like Jill Campbell's comment. Don't take the first one you see, so you won't take the last one.
Yeah, that's a great comment for sure.
Yeah. And then I just mentioned a few things about First Nations traditional harvesting areas. I'm not an expert in that area, so there might be some other people who would be better to talk to about getting into specific areas. And then seaweed harvest protocols and regulations. That is a gray zone that is really interesting. It's getting super popular now, but there isn't really like a hard line issue there. I believe to harvest anything, you need to have a license. As far as I know, it's any marine organism. So if you wanted to take sand dollars off of the beach, even though you're not really eating them, you still have to have your license. But maybe Chris, you could tell us more about that.
Yeah, so that one you need to go to I believe it's the aquatic plant harvesting guidelines set out by the government of Canada. It's actually, again, one that I don't do a lot of seaweed harvesting myself, and I wouldn't want to say the wrong thing, but there is guidelines and outlines, but my understanding is it's a very much a gray zone as well. And then there's again a lot more pressure and a lot more people getting into the commercial side of it. So I think the rules and regulations for that are going to definitely get a lot stricter and actually become more defined with that, hopefully too. But that's something I can look into and then add to that list that someone requested. So we could put that link in with the resource references because I do have the link somewhere for that. Yeah. Any other questions?
There are a couple of questions on the...
Oh, there's a Q&A slide too.
Yeah. So Chuck was saying, I live on a sailboat. I do not have internet access. How can I get the latest regulations? Is there a paper version for the year?
Oh, man, that one, I actually don't know. I'd say just call DFO and ask them to mail you one to the marina or go pick up. They could probably print you one. DFO, that's one thing I didn't get to say, but DFO is really willing to work with you. So if you call their numbers, I've called their numbers and not left a voicemail, and they've actually called me back just going through their caller ID. So it's really worth just reaching out to them on that one. There used to be BC Tidal Water booklets, but I haven't gone to just look for one of those in a while. You can usually find them at hunting and fishing stores, but I'm not even sure with the application to online. If you have, so you don't have access to internet, if I don't know if you have access to a phone and cellular at all. Was that in the comment there, because if you do and you can access that, that could help, because you can get the BC Fishing app to at least help with it, but you do need to print off that license for utilization as well.
And Chris, there was actually another question for you. With PSKC having no annual limit, what is your self-restricted annual catch?
Oh, I usually wouldn't take more than 3 a year personally. I think there should really be an annual limit of at most 4. I don't know, but like, I do think there needs to be an annual limit. We're not going to have the database or research to do that. It's not a species that I target a ton. I like to treat it as a treat that I get to enjoy once in a while, but they're very easy to harvest once you know where they are. And as a freediving community, we can actually have a large impact on that species very quickly. I feel there's lots of them in the deep water from what I've seen from photo and video, but we just don't know enough. And so the way Washington is approaching it is great, but it does kind of completely remove the option of harvesting. I think there does need to be an in-between, 1 a day all year long, no annual retention. I don't see that as being something that's sustainable. It's the same even with the hook and line for sculpin. We're not in the spearfishing regs as able to spear it, but you're allowed 8 per day on hook and line. That doesn't make sense either to me. So again, the regs can be a little bit, non-supporting of sustainability. But I think that's where coming together as a community and trying to work forward as a unified body is a really important thing for developing regulations in a positive manner moving forward.
Can I add something? Something that helps me a little bit is to think about, because sometimes like numbers can be easy for people, but numbers are important. Or what I'm trying to say is it's important to be able to be flexible with your numbers. So if right now, let's say the number is 3 or 4 a year, if we're starting to see more and more people free dive, it's important that we're flexible enough to reduce that. I like to picture myself as part of a multi-predator system. In the animal kingdom, most predators in multi-predator systems only take about 2 to 3% of their prey. So if you picture a whole bunch of deer in Ucluelet, and if cougars are eating them and people are eating them, then we would ideally only be taking about 2 to 3% of that population so that it's able to continue. And so sometimes I think we'll see a whole bunch of crabs and we forget that there's other things that are going to eat them too. And so if we see 40 and we're like, I could take like 20 of them, there'd still be a lot. Well, there's also going to be other animals that are going to chip away from that total number.
Dave just posted a link to the BC Tidal Water PDF, which is accessible there. And that's, again, so that's the regulations as they're printed out from, I presume, the start of the year. I would be doubtful that DFO would update that document. So the restrictions and the changes that come throughout the year are something that you would still need to figure out and observe. And it comes down to like those email mailing lists. If you have access to email when you're remote, for whoever was living on the sailboat there previously, sorry I missed the name, but it's something to consider because you're just going to need those updates when you're harvesting, and probably local fishing stores would be able to update you as well, or look into it for you if you're popping into marinas.
Thank you, Chris and Laura. And there's one other question from Trudy asking, are fishing lodges required to have and use descenders on their fleet boats?
Sorry, could you read the question one more time?
Are fishing lodges required to have and use descenders on their fleet boats? I
think they have to, yeah, by law. Yeah. That's my understanding. I don't see how fishing lodges would get a pass. Commercial fishing boats, I don't think are required because of the volume they do, which is kind of backwards, really. But I'm not totally sure on that either these days. I haven't line caught rockfish in a long time. Yeah. No, because of depths. Yeah, that makes sense, Dave. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I just saw one more question from Jordan. Recommendations for harvesting invertebrates that may not be listed on DFO, like a sea cucumber.
So sea cucumbers are listed, yeah. You want to take it, Laura?
No, that's okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, sea cucumbers are listed. And you can find most species on there. If there's ones that you can't find, I would say call into DFO and ask. I wouldn't really be able to answer anything on ones that aren't listed in the regulations myself personally. But again, they're really helpful, and you just call your local DFO office, and you know, you could get to know them on a first name basis if you want. And they're usually really supportive. We've done some great events with them in the past. We're looking to do more. It's great because it creates awareness within the community, and it makes it so that they're a more approachable body that people just feel more positive about communicating with. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just see if we've got any more questions. Well, here we go. Chris, any guesses on the number of active spearfishers currently harvesting on the island or for BC? Any projections on the increased uptake of spearfishing? And any thoughts on a voluntary membership and reporting registry?
Any thoughts on the voluntary membership or reporting registry?
Yes.
So by membership, what is being, could whoever asked, I can't open the Q&A chat for some reason.
Okay.
But yeah, if someone could, oh, I think I've got it here now. Yeah, Chris, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on that as to any thoughts on the voluntary membership, I can start answering the other part of it. The number of spearfishers and freedivers on Vancouver Island and in BC in general has grown very quickly. We have seen a large jump in our just community, like general Facebook community pages, and the amount of students that I'm putting through each year is getting busier and busier. Ultimately, the freediving community was growing so fast. That's one of the reasons I developed the freedive harvesting courses, is to start getting people just ethics and sustainability practices for getting out there with the skill sets that they were learning to freedive very quickly over a short period of time, to help avoid impacting our local reefs in a negative way. Very rapid and exponential increase in the sport. I mean, in the local freediving pages, they've jumped from like over 700, they've doubled essentially in membership in the last year, I would say. And then as far as voluntary membership and reporting, yeah, like if there was something that was implemented in place, I would gladly voluntarily report. I think like the DFO app, the Fishing BC, is already set up for that, but I'm just not sure how deep it goes. But the voluntary reporting thing would be something that I would love to see implemented. It doesn't need to be broadcasted to everyone if people are worried about where they're blowing up their spots, but as long as it's something that the DFO registry is able to gain information and utilize that, and utilize that would be the follow-up with that. That would be a great place for things to go with that. I hope I'm answering that question for you with that. Okay, yeah, just let me know if I didn't answer that. I just saw the next one come up there. Do you have good resources for harvesting as well as cooking and eating our catch on this coast? Yeah, as far as resources for cooking and catching, I have a lot of friends that really love to cook and catch, and we use Google for the most part. There's some, there's lots of YouTubes out there. There's some great, local chefs that are starting to do more cook catch series type thing. But other than that, a lot of the resources that Laura pointed out, the Sea Forager guide is pretty awesome. It's cool and it is applicable to our waters. Yeah, other than that, there is, what is it? There's an underwater hunter book. I'll add the other underwater hunting books that exist for spearfishing, but they're not localized. They're more of a general application, and I can add some of those as well to the resources that Laura has put in there, if that's something you guys would like.
I've got to go in about 4 minutes. 8 o'clock's my bedtime. So if anyone has any other questions, I like I really would love to talk about this more. It's one of the things I'm really passionate about. So my email, I'm just going to put it into the chat. And if anyone ever wants to ask questions, send me a message. And then you can find me pretty easily at the Ucluelet Aquarium. Grab some coffee from Zoe's or the Foggy Bean and come down. And love to talk about fish. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure talking to everyone. And yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. This was really lovely.